One of the things we really enjoy doing here at Towson is holding forums where we can exchange ideas and anything at all to do with the health and welfare of our country. And so I want to thank you all for taking the time to engage in this discussion and listen to these brilliant people who are here to help us better understand a lot of the dynamics of our economy. The focus of today's forum is to take a look at the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and how over the 11 years it has affected business, and particularly here in Maryland. Just to have Senator Paul Sarbanes in the room is an honor. This is a man who spent his entire life in service to all of us. He does that with his wisdom and his intelligence. He does that with his heart. He does that with his soul. And he does that every day, every minute of his life, even now. For him to be here with us today is a tremendous honor. Thank you for being with us so dearly. And also our four panelists, Ken Denski, Bill Dockman, who is also an alum of the university, Hugh Moeller, and Steve Kroll. We have some special attendees too, which makes it even more exciting for us, from other colleges and universities. We have representatives here from Loyola College, Stevenson, Morgan, Pace, and the CUNY Brooklyn College. Any others? Is there anybody here from another college that I missed? Well, that's fantastic. Welcome to the Towson family. Also, we have a collaborative effort surrounding this whole sponsorship, including the Towson University's College of Business and Finance, of which we are and Economics, of which we are incredibly proud. It's a groundbreaking institution and a groundbreaking program within our institution, and we're very, very proud of this and the leadership within it. Also, the TU's Department of Accounting has participated in putting this together. And Beta Alpha Psi Iota Zeta, which is the nationally chartered co-ed accounting honorary fraternity, and its wonderful advisor, Dr. Rao. So please join me in a wonderful afternoon of learning, talking, discussing, and contributing to the health of our society. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Leslie. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Rao, the Beta Alpha Psi Iota Zeta Chapter Faculty Advisor at Towson University. A round of applause for my officers who have done so much to make this event happen. Thank you. It's my honor to introduce Senator Paul Sarbanes. We Marylanders very proudly know him as the man who represented us in Annapolis and Washington, D.C. for 40 years. Mr. Sarbanes is no stranger to us accountants as well. This introduction is for the benefit of the younger member of our audience, our students. Mr. Paul Sarbanes was born in Salisbury, Maryland to Greek parents. He graduated from Vico Mico Senior High School. He earned his undergraduate degree from Princeton University, magna cum laude. He then earned his second undergraduate degree as a Rhodes Scholar at Balliol College, Oxford University with first-class honors. After he returned to the United States, he joined Harvard University School of Law and earned an LLB degree cum laude. He then clerked for federal judge Morris Soper before entering private practice with 2 Baltimore law firms. Mr. Sarbanes was drawn to public service at a young age. He began his political career in 1966 when he was elected to the Maryland House of Delegates. During his term as a state delegate, he served on the Judiciary and the Ways and Means Committees. He was elected to the United States House of Representatives in 1970 from the 4th District of Maryland and was re-elected in 72 and 74 from the 3rd District. During his time in the House, Mr. Sarbanes served on the Judiciary Committee, the Merchant Marine and Fishery Committee, and Select Committee on House Reorganization. In August 1974, Mr. Sarbanes was selected by the House Watergate Committee to introduce the first article of impeachment for obstruction of justice against President Richard Nixon. In 1976, Mr. Sarbanes was elected to the United States House of Senate. He later went on to win re-election 4 more times, each time receiving no less than 59% of the vote. Mr. Sarbanes believes that opportunity and fairness are principles fundamental to a decent and just society. Throughout his public service, he worked hard to provide the citizens of Maryland with dedicated, independent representation based upon intelligence and integrity. Representation which gives people the confidence that elected officials are there to serve the public interest. In response to the 2001 failure of Enron Corporation and the accounting wars at WorldCom, Mr. Sarbanes, in his capacity as chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, held a series of comprehensive hearings, resulting in the passage of a bipartisan bill designed to reform the accounting industry and restore the investor confidence that had been eroded. The bill passed both houses by overwhelming margins, 423-3 in the House and 99-0 in the Senate. On July 30, 2002, President George W. Bush signed it into law. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act is considered one of the most far-reaching reforms of American business practices since the Great Depression. Today, if you Google the word Sox, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act is listed ahead of the Boston Red Sox and the Chicago White Sox. We are very fortunate to have the Senator give us a behind-the-scenes account of the drafting of this groundbreaking law and discuss the driving force behind it. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Honorable Paul Sarbanes.
I'm very pleased to be back on the Towson campus. Lots of very good things are happening on this campus, and I want to thank your president and all those connected with the university for the outstanding job that's being done here. Towson actually is one of the main universities of our state and increasingly becoming more and more important and significant in my perception. And how many students are you up to? 20,000?
22,300.
Well, I almost got it. All right, good. Yeah. and going, right? Yeah. I've been asked to talk about Sarbanes-Oxley. Now, people wonder, well, where did the name, how did this name get on this bill? Well, I was the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee at the time. I'll tell you a story about that in a moment. And Mike Oxley was chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, which were the two committees in the Congress that were involved in the drafting of this legislation, taking it to the floor and getting it passed. Can you hear all right in the back? Good. This is a nice audience. I used to do forums in high school auditoriums all across the state. I got up one night there were about 300 people in this high school auditorium, so it was quite a good turnout for this forum. And I tested the microphone. I said, "Can you hear me in the back?" A woman in the back of the auditorium yells out, "We can't hear you." At which point a lady sitting right in the front row, literally right there, right in front of me, leaps to her feet, turns to the woman in the back of the auditorium and says, "I'll trade places with you." You didn't have to be a rocket scientist to know that there was going to be a tough evening ahead of you. So we were the chairman of the two committees the time we brought this bill out, so they put our names on it. And that's how we get Sarbanes-Oxley. The people in Oxley's congressional district in Ohio were wondering why Oxley changed his first name to Sarbanes here at the end of his career. And the people in Maryland were wondering why I, at this late stage, was going around with a hyphenated last name. So, I want to take you back to the situation as it existed back in 2001 and recount what in effect precipitated or prompted this legislation. And then I want to talk a bit about how we put the legislation together, how we framed it. You know, there's a story that there are two things the American people should never see how they are made. One is sausage, and the other is laws. So I'm going to try to take you behind the scenes a little bit and show you how this law was made, what we identified as the problems, what we did to try to correct it, and then how it's worked very quickly subsequently. And I think we're going to go to questions before we go to the panel. Am I right about that or not? Am I going to? Yeah, all right, well, whatever. I had just become chairman of the banking committee. That Senate had 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans when we first took office, the beginning of 2001 after the elections of 2000. And of course then the vice president cast the tie-breaking vote. The vice president was Dick Cheney, and he voted for the Republicans to organize the Senate. So I became the senior Democrat, what they call the ranking minority member. It sounds like a lot, but it doesn't really mean much, as opposed to being the chairman. So we're proceeding along, and then in the spring of 2001, Senator Jim Jeffords of Vermont decided that he was going to change sides and go from the Republican side to the Democratic side, thereby giving us a 51-49 majority and the ability then to reorganize the Senate. Since I was a senior Democrat on the committee, I, not automatically, but close to it, moved into becoming the chairman. Now, when I was elected to the Congress, this is an aside, but I just want to make this observation. As I was elected to the Congress, I was very critical of the seniority system. In fact, I even argued against it and so forth. But I have to confess to you, the longer I stayed in the Congress, the more value I came to see in the workings of the seniority system. So I became chairman of the committee, if I may for a moment. All hail to Jim Jeffords in Vermont for making that possible. And I met with the press, and they want to know, well, what's your agenda? What's the agenda of the new chairman going to be with respect to the work program of the committee? And I set out what I thought our agenda would be. In fact, I put a big emphasis on affordable housing. Housing was part of our jurisdiction. Little knowing what was just lurking around the corner. In October of that year, Enron filed a major restatement. In November, Enron, the 7th largest public company in the U.S., who had been reporting earnings rising at 20% a quarter over the previous quarter. I mean, their earnings were on an ascending line that went just like that. In November, they filed another restatement of earnings. And in the first week in December, they filed for bankruptcy. The largest bankruptcy in U.S. history up to that point. Now, it was eclipsed some 6 months later by WorldCom when they went into bankruptcy. So this is what happened. When I gave my talk and set out the agenda for the committee, I mentioned investor protection, which was a matter I'd always thought of considerable importance, but I didn't expect it to be front and center on the agenda. Well, as it turned out, Enron was just the canary in the mine shaft. A number of major companies were engaged in convoluted and often fraudulent accounting practices to inflate their earnings, hide their losses, and drive up their stock prices. And Enron was symptomatic of what was to come. So we were, in fact, just to underscore how it was perceived at that time, I'm trying to take you back to that time, and for a lot of you, you were, I don't think you were even in high school yet at that point. So just to outline this a bit, Paul Volcker, former chairman of the Federal Reserve, and Arthur Levitt, former chairman of the SEC, wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal back about this time, and they said in it, they warned of the danger of falling into a collective amnesia toward the real pain and loss that investors suffered. Over a period of months, market values of public companies fell by some trillions of dollars. Thousands of jobs were lost, retirement savings dried up. The Wall Street Journal, surveying the situation, concluded the scope and scale of the corporate transgressions of the late 1990s now coming to light exceed anything the U.S. has witnessed since the years preceding the Great Depression. Fortune magazine said phony earnings, inflated revenues, conflicted Wall Street analysts, directors asleep at the switch. This isn't just a few bad apples we're talking about here. This, my friends, is a systemic breakdown. And Money Magazine described it in these words: a total failure by everyone, a complete breakdown in the system, in all of the checks and balances. Well, I was confronted how to proceed. Some say, well, you immediately have to bring a bill out. Strike while the iron is hot. I was uncomfortable with that. I thought, well, no, we really need to do a series of hearings and lay a basis for any legislation. I mean, there are differing points of view about what needs to be done. And we need, in effect, to help educate the public and our colleagues about what has happened and how we respond to it. So I scheduled a series of hearings over the first few months of 2002. In fact, we had 10 hearings, very intensive period. We brought in some of the best experts from all across the country to testify in front of the committee. As an example, we led off with 5 former chairmen of the Securities and Exchange Commission. These chairmen of the SEC, some had been appointed by Democratic presidents, some appointed by Republican presidents. But we brought them all in, and anyone really interested ought to go back and get that hearing and read that particular transcript. And then we went from there over the 2-month period that then followed, with a number of witnesses, both from the public and the private sector. We had one panel with 3 former chief accountants of the SEC at the witness table, sitting there in front of us. Well, I have to say, this was pretty dry testimony, to put it mildly. At one point, a colleague of mine, sitting over here, not realizing that his microphone was alive, on, says, "This is really boring." Well, he was right, but he shouldn't have said it out loud in the hearing room. Well, that provoked an interesting reaction. Sitting over on this side was Senator Mike Enzi from Wyoming, Republican senator from Wyoming. And as you'll see later, we were able to work together in a very constructive way on this legislation. But at that point, at this comment about how boring these accountants were, who were at the witness table, Enzi, which is so unlike him, is usually pretty quiet and reticent, leaps into this conversation. Now, Enzi is the only, was then, and I think still is, the only CPA in the United States Senate. Of the 100 members of the Senate, he was the only certified public accountant. So Enzi jumps into this conversation after this comment, and he says, it may be boring to you, but I haven't had this much fun since I came to the United States Senate. Which gives you some idea of the definition of fun in the United States Senate. Well, one of the questions we really had to face right at the outset, where there were two schools of thought about how to proceed or what needed to be done. One school of thought says, well, you have to punish the bad apples. If you just punish the bad apples, so increase the fines, increase the jail terms, all the rest of it, that'll address the situation. The other approach was, no, there's something broke down in the system. The system itself is faulty. It's not exercising the proper checks and balances, and we need to explore that and see what changes can be made so we get the gatekeepers back on the job, so to speak, doing their job, and we get the internal checks and balances within the system working to prevent these things from happening. Well, we had an interesting witness, John Coffey, who's a distinguished professor of securities law at Columbia University, was in front of our committee, was one of the witnesses. So they kept, particularly the bad apple people, kept pressing Coffey about, well, wouldn't that do the job? Well, Coffey said, look, he said, these people ought to be punished, and they ought to be punished very severely. He says, but by definition, by the time you have a bad apple, harm has been done to a number of people. That's why they're a bad apple. They didn't do what they were supposed to do, and people got hurt financially by that. So he says, you need to do more than just punish the bad apples. This idea of deterrence, he said, it has, obviously it has something to it, and we use it a lot in how we approach problems. But he says it's not enough, and he told two stories to illustrate it. One was a fellow named Sam Antar, who was a former chief financial officer of a home electronics firm that had cooked its books over a period of time. And Antar was the actor in doing all of this. So they asked Antar, what about stiff sentences, real punishment? Wouldn't that have deterred him? And he said, they, meaning stiff sentences, would not stop me. He says, you need to build barriers like good internal controls, and you need sharp auditors. So that's as a major offender, that's his take on what needed to be done. The other story Coffey told, which I like very much, is that about punishment and deterrence. He says in 18th century London, the penalty for pickpocketing was death by hanging. And the hangings would be public hangings on Tyburn Hill, right next to the Tower of London. I actually, on a visit to London, went and visited Tyburn Hill just to see where this apocryphal story supposedly took place. And Coffey tells a story that a pickpocket was apprehended, he was tried and convicted, and he was sentenced to be hung, a public hanging on this particular morning, certain date. The morning of the hanging, thousands of people assembled on Tyburn Hill to see the hanging of this convicted pickpocket. And working the crowd of thousands of people were hundreds of pickpockets. So much for deterrence. I don't minimize it, and punishments do play a role, but it seemed to us that it wasn't enough, and we started examining what had gone wrong with the system and what might be done about it. So we worked carefully through these hearings over this period of time. We're now talking about the early part of 2002. All these stories are coming out. I mean, the Enron thing is still dominating the coverage. Other companies are exposed for having engaged in these manipulative and fraudulent practices, and there's considerable agitation about this. So we began our work, and we fairly quickly concluded on what we thought the problems were. And for those that are in the field, I know this will be of particular interest to you. First of all, it became clear that there was inadequate oversight of auditors. The auditing profession was self-regulated. There was no independent outside oversight body that examined what they were doing to see whether they were doing it properly or not. They were supposed to examine one another through professional organizations, and that had broken down. I mean, they never really found anything wrong with what their colleagues were doing. Secondly, there was a lack of auditor independence, which was a serious problem. In the mid-1970s, auditing represented 70% of all revenues of auditing firms. What they called management advisory services accounted for just 12%. So the bulk of the revenue was coming from the auditing function. By the end of the century, some 25 years later, the pattern had reversed. The auditing fees were about a third of the revenues, and the management services were over 50%. Well, that raised the concern that auditors would pull their punches on the audit. In effect, we'll do an audit that was responsive to the company's wishes in order to get the management services contracts, because the source of their revenue had shifted markedly. Thirdly, we had weak corporate governance procedures, inadequate disclosure provisions. For example, I won't run through all of them, but Ken Lay, the head of Enron, shortly before Enron's first financial restatement, which was in October of 2001, Ken Lay told the Enron employees at a corporate-wide meeting, which was also telecast into their offices, quote, "My personal belief is that Enron is an incredible bargain at current prices." Now, this was just before they filed their first restatement of earnings. Now, Ken Lay did not tell the employees when he made this presentation that he had unloaded a substantial amount of company stock in the previous 2 months. And because of loopholes which existed in the law at that time, he didn't have to report it right away, or even in a short period of time. So he's unloading his stock. They're about to do a restatement, and he's telling the employees, "My personal belief is that Enron is an incredible bargain at current prices." Then we had the conflicts of interest of the stock analysts who were working primarily for investment houses. Now what they did is that the stock analysts would supposedly study the stock of a company, their financial records, and then they would put a buy or sell recommendation on that stock. So they were recommending all of these various stocks as a buy, telling people to buy them. Then they would send emails to one another saying what a piece of garbage that stock was. So they put out to the public, to their clients, the public, a buy recommendation, and then they communicate with one another about it and say what a piece of garbage that stock was. Although they didn't use the term garbage, I cleaned it up a little bit for the sake of the crowd here, but or maybe I shouldn't have, I don't know, but so we went through all of these things, and then here's what we came in and recommended, and I want to talk a little bit about how we got there, but first let me just set out what we did. First of all, we ended the self-regulation of the auditing profession and established the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, which is really the sort of major institutional change we made in the recommendations. This requires accounting firms that audit public companies. We limited it just to public companies. In other words, companies that are listed on an exchange, and the theory behind that is that those markets really have to reflect honesty and integrity. Otherwise, investors become leery of the American capital markets, and the reputation of our markets traditionally for honesty is an extremely important economic asset. We now require that accounting firms that audit public companies must register with the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. The board has broad discretion to set auditing standards, to investigate, and when necessary, to impose penalties. Now this change was really made necessary by self-regulation's failure to meet the criterion of independence, which was initially set out in the 1933 and 34 Securities Acts and spelled out by the Supreme Court in the Arthur Young decision in 1984. And that decision reads in part, and I just want to quote it: by certifying the public reports. You see, every company, the public company that lists on an exchange, has to get an opinion from an independent certified public accountant. That's required by law, and they must do that. The Young decision said, by certifying the public reports that collectively depict a corporation's financial status, the independent auditor assumes a public responsibility transcending any employment relationship with the client. The public watchdog function demands that the accountant maintain independence from the client at all times and requires complete fidelity to the public trust. Well, that obviously was not happening. And we set out to try to set up the checks and balances which would ensure that it took place. Secondly, we tried to address the question of auditor independence by prohibiting accounting firms from offering a broad range of consulting services to the companies they audit. They could do those consulting services for companies they didn't audit, but for companies they audit, they couldn't get in the position of auditing them and at the same time doing a whole range of management services. Thirdly, we set standards for corporate responsibility in particular, and of great significance, I think, public companies must have audit committees made up of independent directors. Every director on the audit committee must be independent, without a connection to the management. Auditors now work for the audit committee and not for the management. Auditors are hired, fired, and their compensation is set by the audit committee of the board of directors, not by the management of the company. The management of the company and their practices are, after all, what the independent auditor comes in from outside to examine. So you want the independent auditor to have this kind of independence that the court talked about, and meet this, in a sense, public responsibility. And we thought one way to do that was that they wouldn't be hired by the management, they wouldn't be fired by the management, the compensation wouldn't be set by the management. It would be done by the audit committee of the board of directors, and the audit committee was required to have all independent directors. In other words, directors without a tie to the management. We are trying to set up these checks and balances within the corporate structure. The audit committee was required to set up procedures to receive and handle complaints from whistleblowers within the company about accounting practices and auditing practices. That those whistleblowers were to be protected in terms of them being anonymous. So this was a very important change, and a lot of the discussion now focuses on the role of the audit committee. There are continuing efforts undergoing to strengthen the audit committees. We required CEOs and CFOs to vouch directly for the accuracy of their company's financial statements. They have to sign on the dotted line. It's amazing the kind of impact that has when you have to put your John Henry on there. We required numerous disclosures. The Ken Lay thing could not happen today because one of the things we required is that trades in company stock by management or by 10% shareholders had to be disclosed within 2 days. Ken Lay could have been selling his stock, but he would have had to publicly reveal it within 2 days. We sought to address the analyst's conflict of interest by requiring the SEC and the exchanges to adopt rules prohibiting the conflicts that undermine analysts' independence. So they get a measure of protection. So they can call them as they see them. Before, one wing of the investment house, which was trying to get investment banking business from a corporation, would want their analysts to put a good recommendation on the corporation, because if you don't give them a good recommendation, we won't get this business. So we tried it as best we could to sever that connection. And of course, there was a significant increase in civil and criminal penalties in the legislation, which, I mean, that didn't come out of our committee, but actually came out of the Senate Judiciary Committee. They sort of went through and at least doubled or tripled everything that was already on the books. Well, what's happened? The PCAOB has now been set up. It's now going for about a decade. In fact, they just put out a report on the first 10 years of Sarbanes-Oxley. I commend this to you. PCAOB, 10 years. It's a 10-year review of what's happened under the. And while I'm recommending reading, I know you didn't expect this, but there's a very good report that Ernst & Young has done about the first 10 years of Sarbanes-Oxley, and I commend that to you as well. Well, now more than 2,400 accounting firms are registered with the PCAOB. A lot of them do not audit public companies. About 1,500 of them are U.S. firms, 900 are roughly speaking, are from overseas. And the PCAOB has been hard at work implementing the legislation. Let me very quickly run through the problems or challenges that have been raised with respect to the legislation. First of all, there were a lot of complaints, particularly in the beginning, about the Section 404 requirement for internal controls. We placed a great emphasis on internal controls. I mean, we perceive internal controls, in other words, the auditors within the company, as a way to nip things right in the bud before they develop to the point where serious damage is done. So we saw the internal control function as extremely important. Now, there was a lot of complaint from the business community about the cost, but Volcker and Levitt, in that article I referred to earlier, said there's a reason that the upfront costs are considerable. For too long, too many companies have lacked adequate internal controls. And more now, companies that go through it have concluded that it really benefited their company. They think they're a better, stronger company because of the improvement in the internal controls. I had a fellow who came up to me once. I spoke to the Institute of Internal Auditors at their annual meeting, and this, of course, they're the people within the company who do this auditing function. So this fellow comes up to me, he says, after I'd spoken, he says, "I think your bill is terrific," he says to me. So I said, that's not what I usually got after I finished speaking. I'd be somebody complaining bitterly about the legislation. I said, "Well, thank you very much." I said, "What do you do?" He says, "I'm the head of the Division of Internal Audits in my corporation." He says, "Before your bill came along, I never could get in to see the CEO. Just couldn't get into his office." He says, "Now," he says, "anytime I want to see the CEO, I just walk right into his office." He says, so for him it was a great accomplishment. I think the grumbling is dampened down now. The PCAOB revised some of the guidance they were giving to make the cost less. There's increasing evidence that the reform has been worth the trouble. Intense scrutiny of accounting methods and internal controls has unearthed lingering problems in the way companies operate, and fixing weak financial controls has nipped a lot of accounting problems in the bud. Now let me just tell a couple of stories real quick, and then I'll mention sort of the subsequent fights we've been having. When we went to work on this legislation in the committee, what's known as a markup of the legislation, I scheduled it for a markup. 3 days before, you had to file amendments. The ranking Republican member, former chairman of the committee, filed 150 amendments. was pretty clear what was coming. I mean, we were, you know, he was out really to prevent the passage of legislation, to prevent the passage of any legislation of consequence. At the time, I wasn't sure I had even the votes of all the Democrats. I mean, we were in a majority of 11 to 10 on the committee. So I postponed the markup. Of course, that led to a lot of speculation that we just weren't going to be able to get this legislation through. It's very deceptive. In the end, it passed overwhelmingly, as was outlined in the introduction. But, you know, we didn't know that's where we were going at the time as we worked on it. And so then I went to work. We were trying, I lined up my sort of shaky Democrats. So I knew I could bring a bill out of the committee, but I didn't want to just bring it out on a straight party vote. I wanted to get some breadth to the vote. So I was meeting with Senator Enzi. We were having these discussions about what could be done to sort of make the legislation more palatable to his side of the aisle. Well, I finally scheduled another markup. You never get people to really decide and focus until you get to a markup. They just kind of don't pay attention. But so I scheduled another markup. This was some 6 weeks after the one that was postponed. And meanwhile, Enzi went home to Wyoming for the weekend, and I had gotten a memo from him listing a whole number of concerns that he and others on his side of the aisle had with respect to the draft legislation we had put down for markup. So I spent the whole weekend with staff working through very carefully all of those proposals. When he came back into Washington on Monday night, we met at 9 o'clock in my office, myself with 2 or 3 staff, and Enzi with 2 or 3 of his staff. And I went over the list very carefully with him. And so I said, well, we can do this. In fact, I wish we'd have thought of it. This is really a terrific idea. We can't do this one exactly the way you proposed, but if we could make some changes to it, we could do this. This is like making sausage, you know. And then I said, now this one we just can't do this. This is contrary to something we're really trying. So we went through the whole list, and at the end we reached agreement. This was about 2 o'clock in the morning. So we've been meeting for about 5.5 hours straight. And we agreed that the next morning at the markup, Enzi and I together would offer an amendment to the legislation as it had been proposed, which would encompass in the amendment the various provisions I outlined that we had agreed upon. Well, the next morning we did that. The amendment was adopted, and the bill was reported out of the committee on a 17-4 vote. So it had all the Democrats and 6 of the 10 Republicans. I mean, they talk about bipartisanship a lot nowadays, but usually they have all of one party and then maybe 1 or 2 from the other. They put that together, they say, well, that's bipartisan. Well, we really were bipartisan. We had a majority of each party in support of what we were putting forth, and we brought it to the committee, and the committee brought it out, and we went to the floor of the Senate. Then WorldCom broke. A week later, after we came out of the committee, WorldCom went in and filed for bankruptcy. Well, you can imagine the storm that created. I mean, it was like a hurricane coming through. And that gave tremendous momentum to trying to enact the legislation. In fact, President Bush, the younger, George W. Bush, who had really kept hands off of this whole process. He hadn't really said or done, he hadn't opposed it, but he hadn't supported it either up to that point. But then he kept saying that Congress has got to pass a bill. I urge them to do something quickly, and the markets are taking another plunge. And so we brought it to the floor, and we moved it through very expeditiously, and it went into law, as I said. Let me mention 3 other challenges to it that have happened. One, another major criticism that it was going to cost us our position in the international markets. We wouldn't get companies listing on the U.S. exchange. They said companies are taking their IPOs elsewhere. Well, Goldman Sachs did a good paper on that, and when they pointed out that markets were maturing elsewhere, and we've been urging people around the world to have capital markets. Well, they were getting capital markets, and so when they got capital markets, some of their companies would list in their own capital markets. Secondly, you had strong economies growing up elsewhere, which are in a position to support that. So it's almost a natural consequence of economic developments. Nevertheless, the number of studies has shown there's still a premium a company gains by listing its stocks in the American capital markets. A reputation of our markets for integrity and sort of the regulation that ensures some honesty has an impact, and it makes a difference. And of course, what's happening is that we were worried actually that there would be a race to the bottom, that other countries would try to come in with lower standards to attract business. A little bit of that has happened, not much. Generally, the trend has been the other way. Other companies are adopting versions of Sarbanes-Oxley. They're adopting versions of the Independent Audit Committee. They're adopting provisions to strengthen internal controls. So, in effect, they're all moving to a higher standard and not to a lower standard. In this country, we had a constitutional challenge to the legislation. Went to the Supreme Court. Well, you never know what kind of decision you're going to get. And this one, in the end, just a couple of years ago, the court ruled one tiny provision of the law unconstitutional, but upheld everything else. The part that ruled unconstitutional, we have provided that the members of the PCAOB could only be removed for cause. The SEC appoints them. And they said, no, that's too far removed from the executive power, because the president appoints the SEC, and then they appoint these people, and then these people get a protection from being anyhow. So they put it at will, and that is not of high significance. And fourthly, there's been some effort in the Congress to undo parts of this legislation. They recently did this so-called jobs bill to try to encourage IPOs, and they're really giving them a pass on a lot of the provisions of Sarbanes-Oxley. An IPO, emerging growth company, which are the ones that get the exemption for a limited period of time, are defined as $1 billion in revenue and $700 million in market caps. Well, you're not playing around with small companies here. And so that's been sharply criticized. We'll see how that works out. I frankly think it's a scandal waiting to happen. And then you sort of say, won't we ever learn? But in any event. Let me close quickly because I would just want to quote Chairman of the SEC, Bill Donaldson, who was the chairman during the time we put this into place. He did a magnificent job, and the people at the SEC, in setting up the PCAOB, getting it up and going, getting it really full-fledged, and they've attracted terrific talent at the. But Donaldson, at the time the legislation was being criticized, and he rejected suggestions, including in the press, that the recent crackdown on corporations and executives by criminal and civil authorities, including the Commission, have discouraged honest risk-taking. That was one of the arguments that was being made. On the contrary, he said, Sarbanes-Oxley and the other steps that have accompanied it will lead to an environment where honest business and honest risk-taking will be encouraged and rewarded. And he kept returning to his fundamental point, which was successful corporate leaders must strive to do the right thing in disclosure, in governance, and otherwise in their business. And they must instill in their corporations this attitude of doing the right thing. They should make this approach part of their company's DNA. We feel that Sarbanes-Oxley strengthens the statutory infrastructure to address these problems. It's part of a continuing process of restoring honest, transparent, ethical business practices and the indispensable safety mechanisms to keep them in place. In my judgment, we can do no less because the integrity of our capital markets and the confidence of our investors, and therefore the underlying strength of the economy, are at stake. Thank you all very much. Apparently I used up the question period. I apologize. I'll hang around afterwards if someone. The two things I recommend to you, I know you didn't expect me to come and give you reading matter. Well, one is this latest annual report of the PCAOB, and the other is a study made by Ernst & Young, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act at 10, enhancing the reliability of financial reporting and audit quality, which is a very good review not only of the legislation, but of what is transpiring in the profession.